Climate and microclimate are very important in designing different types of structures, farms, dwellings. So we really need to think about how to design our gardens and farms and structures that work with the climate and even with the microclimate and not against that. So we don't want to put structures or gardens, things in an area which take a lot of resources to be able to uphold those because the climate is maybe too cold for the animals or plants that live there, or the structure is one where you have to bring resources from really far away to make that dwelling or building warm enough. So we really want to think of all the materials and ways that we can make our design more in sync with the climate. Let's go on and look at a couple of different types of climates first. Just as a little experiment, and you actually will be part of an experiment that has been done in the past by looking at these 5 pictures of biomes, so different types of large-scale vegetation types. The savanna, which is a grassland and tree system, temperate deciduous forest, which occurs in the eastern half in the Midwest of North America. We've got thick deciduous forests, desert, coniferous forests, which is usually high altitude, and the tropics. I'll ask you 2 questions. Of those 5, which one would you most like to visit for a vacation? And the second question is, which one would you most like to live in permanently? Think about that before you go on to the next slide. The same 2 questions that were asked in the previous slide were asked of a large group of test participants. In the early 80s, these 2 researchers did a study by asking 3rd graders all the way through adult seniors the same question: how much they'd like to live in one of those areas and how much they'd like to visit one of those areas of those 5 different biomes. They found the only real strong kind of correlative significant results of this experiment were that the elementary school kids preferred savannas. Older age classes in this study had mixed results. They usually chose the most familiar biome of the one they wanted to live in the most. One thing that they saw in the elementary school kids is they preferred to live in and even visit the savannas. So then these researchers took a wild leap and thought that this was possibly because humans evolved in the East African savannas, so that they had a predisposition for being attracted to savanna landscapes. It is fairly well established that modern humans evolved or came out of the East African area. The earliest known fossils were from that area about 70,000 years ago. So savanna grasslands are widely spaced trees with low grasses underneath. They tend to be a place that feels safe and protected. You can see your enemies coming, or you can see game, but you still have the protection and the resources from the trees. So they do tend to be a place that a lot of different cultures have found to be ideal for living in. But this climate theory that came out, the savanna hypothesis, was developed out of this study. And it became very controversial when they were claiming this is evidence that humans evolved in the East African savannas because kids liked the savanna habitat. My thought, just as a layperson, not even as a scientist, was that, well, kids like the savannas because they look like parks. You know, they look like their neighborhood park, and they like to go there. But they also, you can talk about how parks themselves are designed on a style of vegetation or biome that is appealing to us. So it really goes back to the fact that humans do have an affinity for savanna-like biomes. For what reason? That's up for debate. Here's a list of different aspects of climate. Precipitation is at the top of the list, and this is kind of in a importance order. So precipitation and temperature are the 2 main factors that influence the type of climate you're going to have. Now, climate is the long-term place-based weather. So when you walk out your door in the morning, you don't say, the climate's nice. You say the weather's nice, or it's not nice. But weather is short-term, climate is like long-term weather patterns. Precipitation and temperature are the two most influential factors on climate. You also wind patterns, continentality, mountain ranges, latitude, humidity, cloud cover, altitude, and seasonality, and storm patterns. They all affect the climate. The only one you might not really know what it is continentality. That means how far or near the edge of the continent that site is. So the higher continentality would be like the prairies in the middle of the United States, middle of North America, that has far from the coast. The weather and the climate is going to be much more influenced by the fact that you are interior in a continent, not by the oceans or storms that come from the ocean. Like the middle of the United States, the storms come from Canada, so they come from one continent, one land mass to another. You know, it's not influenced by the ocean like coastal California is. Species diversity is also influenced by climate, and you can see that with the latitudinal gradient of biodiversity. Around the equator is where we have the highest diversity of species, the highest diversity of mammals and birds, reptiles, amphibians, plants, marine bivalves, ants. You're seeing in the top right image a graph of the diversity of ant species by latitude, and so you have the most diverse ant species at the equator. You've got the most, almost 200 different kinds of ants at the equator, where you have, it diminishes in diversity as you go towards either pole. And that is also typical of all these different groups of organisms listed in the text there. Also interesting is languages follow this same pattern of diversity, this latitudinal gradient. You have more different kinds of languages near the equator and more different types of cultures as well. And you also have more different, more diverse economic systems around the equator and lower at the poles. And if you want to know more about that, read some detailed notes I put in the presenter's notes. And there's a lot of ideas and theories about why there are more at the equator. Some very simple responses from me would be that you have, it's a lot to do with the climate. You have a lot more warmth and humidity and precipitation. You get more diversity, more plants and animals can live there because there's more food year-round, because there's more growth that's happening all year long. And you get more competition between those animals and plants, between the animals, and you know, like species compete more than different ones in general. And you have more of what we call niche partitioning, or diversifying of those species, speciation, because there's such intense competitive pressures. So that's one reason, but there's a lot of other ideas out there about why this is happening. But just an example of climate influencing many other things that you would be needing to consider in your overall large-scale permaculture design. In the 90s, a couple of researchers from UC Davis were doing work on cropping systems down in in South America, in the Andes, high elevation indigenous cropping systems by Andean farmers. Some were in Peru and some Chile. And they noticed, while studying their systems, interesting ancient methods that were somewhat sustainable, that at night, at nightfall, they would, the farmers would go to a particular spot in the field, an open spot, and look up at a very specific spot in the sky and stare up there. And, you know, some of the first thoughts were, oh, they're just taking the farmers are tired from the day and having a little siesta, staring up into the beautiful stars or the clouds. But as they spent more time with them, they realized, wait, this was a habitual process, and they were looking at a very specific part of the sky over and over at the same time of night. And they found that they were actually doing weather forecasting in their ancient way. These Andean farmers were staring at this particular constellation to get a gauge on long-term climatological patterns. And this is, if you don't know already, the constellation Pleiades. And it has a variety of stars in it, quite a few, and they are of diverse distances from Earth, so they're different brightness, and with varying amounts of cloud cover or high altitude water vapor or not. Some stars are visible and some are not. And so the researchers talked with them, and over a few years realized that these farmers had been looking up at the Pleiades for possibly thousands of years and learning about what it looks like each night and the trends in the changes of the stars' visibility and brightness or not brightness indicated whether El Nino or La Nina events were approaching, which was very important for their cropping systems, which have been going also for thousands of years, to be able to predict these things, to know about planting times and harvest yields that year. So these farmers were accurately able to predict rains and adjust their planting times by looking at these stars and constellations. Well, this particular one. And they were able to predict El Nino events when they were about to come and adjust, because if an El Nino or La Nina event was coming, they would know that the rains would be delayed and sometimes be less rainfall than normal, and they could adjust their planting to that. And so right now, to predict El Nino and La Nina events, we have very elaborate computer modeling, but the Andean farmers were able to do something very similar by very, very close and long-term observation. So this was science. This is what we would call indigenous science, not Western science, but the same thing, observations leading to hypothesizing, and I'm sure over time they noticed when certain patterns in the night sky would occur later, a few months later, they would see maybe some of the rainfall patterns shift, and over time, over many, many, many years, that was able to be hone those predictive qualities and look for even more fine-scale changes in the weather and in the stars to be able to do even more fine-scale predictions. Pretty cool stuff. This is just a sample from a local market of the many types of potatoes that are grown at these high-altitude Andean farms. They grow about, it's almost 4,000 different types of heirloom potatoes. They're called heirloom now, but they were just the potatoes that these people grew for a long time. And this is high altitude, rocky soil, so they had to be really good at understanding the system to be able to actually eke a living out of this. And they have been for a long time. And like I said earlier, weather as opposed to climate is just a short-term, localized type of climatological event. So like a tornado, it happens in an area and it's over within a day. Weather is usually kind of a daily basis thing. So we wouldn't plan our designs around weather, because that's just like planning, looking at a scientific study and only taking one piece of data from the study and drawing conclusions from it. Like with statistics, you need a lot of data to find patterns and trends. So weather would not be enough information to use to understand the climatological patterns and trends. You need to look at climate and use climate in your design. Microclimate, that is a very short-term but spatially localized type of climate. So my first example that I think of is a dwelling. You have microclimates on different sides of the home. On the north side, here in the northern hemisphere, on the north side of a dwelling, the sun is going to hit less. It's shadier, and because it's shadier, it's cooler. And because it's shadier and cooler, the soil is more moist, and you get more organic matter buildup. The plants germinate more, grow more, and they don't dry out as much as on the south side, and you tend to get richer soils and more vegetation. So, kooky example, if you're going to have an apple tree in Santa Barbara It's really good to plant it on the north side of your house, where in the winter it'll get cold. Most apples like a cold snap in the winter. They don't like to be growing all year long. They don't like warmth all year long. They want a frost, if not a freeze. So north side of your home would be the best place to put it. So this is just a little example of the overall idea of topography having a big effect on the microclimate. You all who live in Santa Barbara would know that there are distinct microclimates because of the topography. We've got south-facing slopes, which are warmer, hotter, drier, more exposed to the sun. And you've got north-facing slopes, which are cooler or moister. If you ever hiked around, you notice in the canyons, it's cooler, moister, shadier, and that's where you get the big trees, like the oaks. Or you get oaks on the north-facing slope too, or the canyons. On the hotter, drier slopes, we have chaparral because it's hotter and drier, and the soil is not as moist, and different plants that are adapted to that drier, warmer weather live there. When you're designing something, you really think about this. Where would we place the chicken coop or the goat pen that aren't going to be harsh for those animals? Do they like it cold and cooler and shadier, or do they like it hot and dry and warmer, or somewhere in between? So aspect is the way the slope of the hill faces. East-facing aspect is warmest in the morning. That's where the sun comes up first. West-facing aspect is warmest in the afternoon and warmer overall than even the east ever gets in the morning, because by the time the sun is, think of your home and you've got the sun coming up and it hits the east side first, and then the sun keeps coming up until noon, and now it's directly overhead, and now the air is warmer and the earth is warmer and the building's warmed up a little, and then you have that same amount of sun as you did from morning till noon. You have that same amount from noon till sunset, and that sun now further warms up the building and the earth and the air. So the west-facing side is going to get hotter overall than the east side ever did on that building. And that's where you would put things like, tropicals, if you have water, like plumeria, or animals and plants that need warmth if you're in a cooler area. So aspect is important for microclimate. So is the slope. That's how steep it is. The closer the incidence of the sun's rays are to 90 degrees. So if you've got a slope that's pretty steep and the sun's rays, which come at an angle, because the sun is in the southern sky here in the northern hemisphere, even in the summer, it's not all the way overhead like at the tropics. It's down a little bit. And if you can imagine a hillside where the sun's rays are hitting it, the more steep that hill is, the closer these sun's rays will hit that hillside at a 90-degree angle. At a 90-degree angle, that solar ray incidence is it maximizes the amount of energy that comes from the sun rays and is transferred into that object, into the land or that building. So if you have a very low slope, it's a more oblique angle, and you get less transfer of energy and heat from the sun's rays into that slope. So that's how the microclimate can be affected by the slope, and that's part of topography. If you think of our front country here in Santa Barbara, it's basically a big east-west mountain range that has a fairly steep slope, and it's also near the ocean. And so I think I said this in person with you in lecture, but you get extra light here. So the slope is pretty steep, so the angle of the sun's incidence is pretty good, like closer to 90, and you get a lot of transfer of heat from the sun's rays into the mountainside and into the land. But then you also have reflection of the sun's rays off the water onto the land, so you get a little extra light here too. So we have a great microclimate here for growing all kinds of plants, including even tropical plants, if you add a lot of water. Driving up the 101, Gaviota Coast, you'll see this, where you see valleys that are facing east-west, and you'll see that on the north-facing slope is vegetated and green, like on the left side of this picture, and the south-facing slopes on the right side of the picture are dry and grassy. The vegetation's different, the soil is different, the moisture levels are different, and it's just because of their aspect. You gotta think about that when you're planning things in your design. You want to work with that. Also, air movement is related to topography. cold air drainage is when cold air gathers, and cold air is denser than hot air. As you all probably know, hot air rises, cold air sinks. So cold air is denser and it will sink into, following the topography, down the hillside and into the valleys, into the canyons. It doesn't happen during the day because usually the sun is warming the air, and so warm air near the surface of the earth is moving up the slopes and up the canyons. But then as night starts to fall, the sun goes down, the air starts to cool quickly, and it starts to flow down into the canyons and down those canyons and valleys, very similar to how water flows down those canyons and valleys. If you're hiking, and you know this from hiking like in a canyon, and the sun starts to set, it gets cold, and there's even kind of a cold, dank feeling of air moving down the canyon. That's cold air drainage. And you really need to think about that in designing. If you've got animals, plants, people that want to live or have, structures and do activities near those canyons, it's going to be cold at night. Back to our apple example, that would be a great place to put your apple orchard, down in the bottom of the canyon or near that, where it's going to get cold air drainage and give those apples cold air like they like. But it wouldn't be good for the chickens or the people, having your house down in there where it gets just too cold and damp in the evening and you get cold breezes through there. So things to think about when you're designing. Real landscapes are very complex. I'm just giving you very simple examples. As you might know, like sometimes we have storms that come from the northwest in the winter, but the way they hit, they swirl around Point Conception, and the way they hit Santa Barbara is almost like they're from the southwest. It's just because of the complexity of the topography makes the winds change direction on a local scale. Onshore and offshore winds also can have a big influence on where you place elements in your design. Typically, during the day, you have the land heating up more quickly, and than the ocean. So the ocean is denser than the land. Water is denser than the soil. So in general, it doesn't change its temperature as quickly. So when the sun comes up, the land heats up faster. You get warm air rising above the land, and as it rises, it pulls in cooler air off the ocean underneath, and it tends to make kind of a circular pattern, the warm air going up until it gets high enough, and it cools down and falls down over the ocean, and gets sucked in. So you get winds that are going towards the land, onto the shore. And the opposite is happening at night. And these are things to think about with designs too. How's that movement going to affect your design, your crops, your plants, animals, to benefit them or hurt them? Always take all that into account. And these onshore offshores are, they're going to be a microclimate type phenomena that happens near the coast and some large bodies of water. A little bit larger scale, but regional effects from the wind to and topography are Santa Ana winds, which happens when a high pressure system moves into the desert just east of here and settles there and kind of pushes hot air up and over the mountain ranges toward the coast. And those winds come up and over the mountain range and kind of scream down the canyons toward the coast, which can create very intense, as you probably have experienced, hot, dry wind events, which even though those aren't that often, they can be very damaging. Water masses will affect the microclimate. As I was mentioning with offshore and onshore winds, the closer a site is to the ocean or a large mass of water, it will have that mass of water will have a moderating effect on the temperature of the land. So you can have very mild climate like we do right near the coast, but for example, then if you drive to San Ynez Valley, they have much more extremes between hot and cold. And it's not good or bad, you just have to think about planning for that. So in San Ynez, you get frosts and freezes, and you also get really high temperatures, over 100 degrees pretty often in the summer. And the plants, some of them like it. Grapes and kiwis and some of our fruit trees will really like those those kind of oscillations between hot and cold, but especially like the dormant season and the cold snap where they can really rest and recharge. If you try to grow, it's hard to grow grapes and things like deciduous fruits that really need a cold period of rest here on the coast. And that's where you'd have to get the low chill type of trees, but it's still challenging. The temperature difference between the ocean and the land is what kind of causes the moderating effect. The ocean holds on to its temperature, doesn't get cooler very fast and doesn't warm up very fast. So it tends to keep the land more moderate in temperature. Also, don't forget that altitude also creates temperature differences. As you go up in elevation, you typically get colder. So for every 1,000 feet of elevation gain, you drop about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's something to consider too in your design if you have a lot of elevational change on your site. Vegetation also has an effect on microclimate. Transpiration is the loss of water from the inside of the plant coming out of the leaves into the atmosphere, and it increases humidity on a local scale around vegetation. If you ever notice flying in an airplane, usually you see clouds over the mountains where there's a lot of forests. That's a lot to do with the vegetation transpiring and putting water vapor into the air, and that's where that water vapor kind of gathers and forms clouds. Of course, you need water for that to happen. But plants are reservoirs of water in general, and they will make the area around them cooler because of the transpiration and introduction of more humidity. Some interesting examples. On the left is around the Santa Barbara area, and it's just showing you the clouds forming over the Santa Ynez Mountains in the summer. Sometimes these turn into thunderheads, so that effect can be dramatic and create significant precipitation for your site if you're in that area. And on the bottom right is just the formation of lenticular clouds like pancakes in a stack over a high mountain range. Know also that vegetation is a really good, efficient form of light blockage. So trees with all their leaves and shrubs and vegetation are made to collect as much light as possible. That's how these plants are getting their food. A tree will block 3 to 6 times more light and absorb that much more light than an awning in a single plane, because there's a lot of overlap of leaves and many leaves pointing slightly different angles. So they're very, very efficient light gatherers and very efficient transformers of solar energy into biomass. And take that into consideration. Later in the day, the sun can be too intense. You can place trees to intercept that. That might deter too much light on your animal pen or certain crops or on your dwelling. Dark, thick, coarse-leaved plants absorb more sunlight and heat than the lighter, thin-leaved plants that are more based for cooler or shadier or tropical environments. And shiny light-colored leaves reflect a lot of light, so they can help you in that way too. So use vegetation to your advantage in your design to make things more efficient, and giving all the other organisms, helping to give them what they need more to thrive and survive. Windbreaks are a great way to use vegetation to help affect the microclimate. You can divert wind away from certain elements in your design that might be damaged by the hot winds or the cold winds, or you can funnel wind towards a certain element like a home say in the summer, because you want those onshore winds to kind of give you cool breezes through your home in a hot tropical area. Just some ideas for designing with climate and microclimate.